Hello, students, and back by popular demand is our flipped classroom on federalism, an incredibly important topic to understand in AP government. So what you want to do as you're watching this lecture, you want to have at your Cordell notes because in this video we are going to discuss the basics of federalism. I'm going to introduce to you what federalism is. We're going to look over a timeline of federal authority. And of course, we're going to define what federalism is. So by the end of this video, you should have these three key components completed. All right, my defenders of democracy. So what is federalism? So federalism, as we know from our discussions in class thus far, federalism is a way of organizing a nation, in this case the United States, between two or more levels of government that have formal authority over land and people. In our system of government, we have multiple layers of government. We have the federal government. We have state governments. We have, in New Jersey, we have county governments. We have municipal governments, and we have school governments. All of these, you fit into every bit of these governments. And these governments all have rules and regulations and play a role in your day-to-day life. So unitarian governments, uni meaning one, have their government organized in the way that power resides all within a central government. A confederation would be an example of the United Nations, where it's a conglomerate, not a conglomerate, but it's a group of countries, each have their own sovereignty, but they are all acting as one unit. So the biggest controversy with with Great Britain and the European Union, Great Britain was a part, or is still a part of it. Trade deals are negotiated rather than negotiating with each individual country separately. It's negotiated with Europe as a whole. That's an example of a confederation. As you know, the United States had a confederation early on under the Articles of Confederation. That did not work out well for us. Intergovernmental relations, it's the workings amongst the federal system. And when we get to the later parts of this year, you will see that our government is big, it is complex, and it at times is efficient and at times can be inefficient. But the intergovernment relations is the working of the federal system and the entire set of interactions among the national, state, and local governments. All right, so this is a timeline of federal authority. There's a couple slides here that we want to go over. All right, so the period from 1787 to the 1840s, this is what's known as enumerated powers federalism. And what do we mean by enumerated powers? Well, just that. When you enumerate something, you number it. So the founding fathers and early presidents and members of Congress, they used their powers of government very specifically. They didn't really reach beyond what the Constitution authored or argued. They said if it's not written in the Constitution, we really don't have the ability to do it. So you'll see a couple of exceptions. For example, Thomas Jefferson kind of played it fast and loose with Article 2 when he accepted the treaty. When he bought the Louisiana Territory, the Senate said, well, the government really doesn't have that authority. Jefferson increased power there. But for the most part, from George Washington up to right before the Civil War, presidents really, were very limited in their power, and the federal government, therefore, was limited in its power. For the most part, the states were I don't want to say all powerful, but they were the important figures. And the big issue, as you know, from 1878 to the 1840s is this issue of sectionalism and slavery as the country struggled to deal with that. From the 1850s to the 1920s, this is known as fundamental federalism. Just prior to the Civil War and all the way up to the 1920s, we have fundamental federalism. And this is where the federal government makes laws and sets policies, but the states have a very interesting way of defining these policies. The best example I can give you guys is although slavery was abolished by constitutional amendment, there were still ways that the Southern government, through black codes and other bureaucratic resistance, was able to segregate or impose their will on African Americans. And we see that happening, especially with Jim Crow laws in the South. All right. Beginning in the 1930s, we have something called New Deal federalism. And this takes us all the way up to 1975. Now, just a little piece of advice. As you're writing these notes down and listening to this lecture and discussion, think about the time period. So a helpful hint on the AP exam or any future exam. If you get a federalism question, it's always good to remember the time period. So if you get a question that's 1878 to 1840s, it's enumerated powers. It's exactly what the Constitution gives the Congress and the president. If it's 1850s to 1920s, we're talking about the emergence of the states. But really, what happens in 1929? You have the stock market crash, and then in the 1930s, it's the Great Depression. And you have Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal with a huge expansion of governmental power. And with that government power is money. And the federal government now begins to take over and assert its authority over the states, really, in terms of highway projects like the Hoover Dam, the WPA, and the Social Security Administration. And then in 1964, with the Civil Rights Act, enforcing civil rights laws, expansion of Medicaid and Medicare, block grants to the states, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. But think about it like this. If you get pressed on a federalism test question between the 1930s and 1975, you know that the power and the role of the federal government is expanding. Then we have from 1986 to really modern day, we have state sovereignty federalism, or what's going to be known as devolution. I'm going to talk a little bit about that towards the end of our presentation. But this idea is where the New Deal was a Democratic program under Franklin Roosevelt, and we had a series of Democratic presidents like Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, and even Carter. They're all going to be presidents that expand the size and scope of federal government. Whereas presidents from 1986 to 2017, we have 12 years of Republican rule, 8 under Reagan, 4 under George Bush, 8 under Clinton, and even Clinton governs as a centrist Democrat, where power of the federal government, the size of the federal government, begins to shrink and power is given back to the states. Not entirely. The federal government's not abdicating from its responsibility, but more power and authority is given to the states. All right. Just to recap, again, this doesn't fit anywhere in your notes per se, but this is a chart that's in your textbook comparing the 3 types of styles, the unitary, confederate, and federal system. All right. So let's define federalism. So why is federalism so important? Well, number one, it decentralizes our politics, first and foremost. It creates more opportunities for people to participate. And what do we mean by that? Why are there more opportunities for people to participate? Well, now remember back to those linkage institutions that we talked about. People can now get involved in their county government, their municipal government. They can get involved in their state government. They can get involved and petition the federal government. Federalism also decentralizes our policies. So now, we may have a initiative from the Department of Education for schools across the country, but each state is able to kind of interpret that a little differently. Okay? The federal and state governments handle problems differently. For example, drinking age, marriage license, speed limits. New Jersey is one of the more conservative states when it comes to speed limits. Also, for example, how much money is set aside for disaster relief? States in certain areas that may not have disaster awareness. For example, as we're seeing right now, California, they have a lot of money earmarked for wildfires, where people out in the Midwest will have money earmarked, disaster earmarks for tornadoes. People on the coast will have money earmarked for coastal storms and coastal erosion. So federalism allows the states, it gives the states individuality while still remaining unified under one system. And the big thing here is states can solve the same problem in different ways, and they tend to be policy innovators. And what do we mean by that? States tend to generate their own policy in solving crises. For example, the United States, President Trump, a short while ago, came up with an initiative to combat the effects of heroin. Well, money is going to go to the states that are most affected by the heroin crisis, including New Jersey. So that's paramount. right? So that is where I'm going to wrap up this video. So this actually encompasses the first 4 boxes. So it encompasses what is federalism, timeline of federal authority, defining federalism, and why federalism is so important. So when we begin, we'll begin with the box for the next video that says the constitutional basis for federalism. If you need to watch this again and hear this soothing voice in this conversation about the federal government, feel free to replay me.